When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. Welcome back to the Dominion Podcast, episode... Catch a niner in there? Yeah, welcome back. This is our first post-conference episode.
Yep.
So we're glowing still from that, of course.
Oh, yeah.
If you didn't have a chance to make it to our first annual, hopefully first of many Dominion conferences, you missed out. There's some good stuff. A lot of great speakers, really great fellowship, some mediocre singing, and some really great coffee.
Some really great coffee.
That's right. I am one of your hosts, Jeremy.
And I'm Alex.
And who's this guy?
Greg.
Greg. Just Greg.
Just Greg. Greg Hill. Also at the conference, which was fantastic.
Excellent. And one of the reasons we have you on is so we can talk a bit about that. But yeah, I guess let's do some shout outs before we start. The Folklorist. Apparently, Tristan got himself a big retweet this week.
Yeah, he got a shout out from the man Jack Carr himself.
Jack Carr.
Yeah.
I don't know what the kids are doing nowadays, so I didn't know who that was when they told me. But apparently it's a big deal.
It is a big deal. Yeah, if you want to check out the video, Tristan, the Folklorist, made a music video for the soundtrack to the Terminal List, kind of a cover of that. And Jack, I don't know how Jack Carr came across it, but he sent it out on socials, so that was pretty cool. And thanks to Tristan. And man, do you smell the bread that is wafting out through the floor right now?
Mrs. Inglis just knocking it out of the park. She's sending us each home with a loaf of bread. Just for the privilege of having us record in their house. I mean, oh, wait a minute. No, I don't think the bread's for us. But we get to enjoy the lovely aroma.
Yeah. Thanks to them. And as always, Kawartha Classical Christian School. Greg was there today with his wife helping out. We had a history day today.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, and it is awesome. It is impressive. I don't know how Mel Inglis, Mrs. Inglis, the other Mrs. Inglis, I don't know how she gets that place set up in one evening, but you walk in and it's a different world.
Wow.
And the students all do speeches. They all did really well. And yeah, it's good to, in an age where they're canceling history, they're twisting and distorting history.
Yeah.
History is a massive part of a classical Christian education. It's part of a just traditional Western education is history and literature. So we have a very comprehensive historical program at Kawartha Classical. And it goes through cycles. They'll do the ancients and then medieval, modern, whatever. They'll go through this cycle, I think, 4 times over the course of their time at KCCS. Yes. And they're going to come out of this program, even after grade 8, with more history than I had in my history degree, at Trent University. So, which again is not just about learning facts, it's understanding the world. And it's understanding human nature. It's understanding God's work in the world.
Yeah, and when you read Isaiah and God is saying, declaring the end from the beginning. I am God. There is no other. Declaring the end from the beginning. One of the other things he mentions is that God interprets the events of the past.
Yeah,
because it's not just like you said. It's not just
bare facts.
Bare facts. Like they have to be interpreted, and they have to be interpreted in light of God's truth. So, yeah.
Yeah, so it's good to be there with them, and good to see that the work is continuing at Kawartha Classical.
Yes. So what were you? So you guys were just helping with some of the setup, or
yeah, just came in to enjoy seeing the fruits of all the labors, and it is. It's encouraging, particularly in a culture where you're seeing what's happening around us, and to see that next generation understanding it, and to hear them actually giving witness to what that history means, like you said, Alex, and saying this, at the tail end of some of their speeches, they'd say, give a version of what this means for me personally, or what it should mean for us in our modern era. So it's encouraging to see that being built.
We're going to talk about, I think towards the end, more of strategies for building. But our generation, we've all kind of witnessed the collapse of our country. slower at times and other times, faster at other times. But this next generation, my children, they're going to be the ones who are, Lord willing, involved in the rebuilding, you know, and that's something to keep in mind when we talk about our strategy. It's your strategy has to be multi-generational.
Yeah.
You know, if all you're doing is, for example, going to the next protest next weekend, and that's it, you're not really doing anything. But if it feels like, especially with the school and as a parent, pouring into the next generation, like that is so fundamental to our task. And if you fail there, it doesn't matter what else you do. Like if you lose your children, that's why we're in this mess. Like we're in this mess because, you know, there weren't Christian fathers and Christian mothers raising children to fear the Lord. That's why we're here. So, yeah.
Well, do you want to maybe introduce our guest?
So what I thought,
distinguished guest,
our distinguished guest.
That's
Well,
right.
he's a well-traveled guest. That's for
right.
sure.
You know a thing or two about planes, is what you're telling me.
That and like I was saying, that and not a lot outside that scope when it comes to lucrative income options. So,
Yeah. So
as I found out.
I asked Greg to come on because he's been attending Hill City for some time now, and we've gotten to know one another. He attended the conference. He's been a listener and supporter of Dominion, and but has his own sphere and his own world. Yeah, his own gig. And I thought it would be good to think through someone outside of our immediate circle, although we overlap a lot. You know, how are you taking Dominion, and how is God working through that? All of those labors. So why don't you begin, Greg, for our audience sake, introducing yourself, maybe where you grew up and what you ended up doing for a career and how that led to Free to Fly.
Sure. Yeah, I'll try and give you the Reader's Digest version.
Yep.
Born in 1968.
Yep.
Grew up in a solid Christian home. My dad was a military man, so I came by the first season of my career, honestly. Ended up flying the planes that he jumped out of as an Army guy. So from that, spent a lot of time traveling, but also I would say my dad was also a student of history and added a fair bit of that, just understanding the cost at which we enjoy the freedoms that we've got. So, so moved around, really didn't live anywhere growing up more than about 3 years. Joined the military myself. The day I turned 18, I walked through the gates of military college and people started screaming at me for the next number of years. And then I ended up flying with the military for 20 years. And out of that, got to the airlines. And
What type of planes did you fly with the military?
Hercs, C-130. Okay. So the transport thing. I sort of laugh. I started my career during the Top Gun era, so almost everybody wanted to fly fighters. But I honestly wanted to fly transports from the time I was 13. That was my goal.
That's great.
I was the firstborn Type A guy. I remember thinking just a little bit of what you're talking about in terms of how do we build for the future.
Yeah.
So I was a 13-year-old and decided I want to fly airplanes. And because I was pretty driven, uptight type guy, I'm like, what can I do at 13? So I remember memorizing the phonetic alphabet because it was all I could think of to do, right? Which is a pretty small piece, but down the road, 10 years when it came time to learn that for my actual flying career, it was one less thing I had to do at that point.
Was it
right?
Alpha, Beta, Charlie, that stuff?
Bravo.
Bravo.
Yeah, that whole
I'm
one.
thinking Alpha. Beta, Kappa. I'm the Beta host, so
That's right. That's not what I hear.
hey, I'm the Bravo host.
Yeah, there you go, buddy. Moving up.
Yeah, so I flew in the military until 2006, got to the airlines after that, spent some time in the reserve for the first 12 years I was at the airline. And then, the grand fast forward to 2020, unless you want more detail about that phase. But that was how I came about my flying career.
So did you, I do have a question about that. And did you enjoy your time in the military? Like, were you proud to serve in the Canadian military?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's another whole rabbit hole we could delve into for probably a long season, because I would say I'm not anymore looking,
right?
Not so much looking back, but looking what's become of the military, right? And during that season, I use the word season a lot because I like to think of life that way, because otherwise you feel like you're just in a forever winter, right? And I do think life cycles. I'd say I was very idealistic. I mean, I grew up thinking I want to make something of my life and I want to make a difference. And so that's why I did what I did. I'd say towards the latter stages, like when I finished up, it was nothing but deployments to Afghanistan, like over and over and over again. And there was a 6-month period where I commanded the airlift over there, in and out. And so you'd have people cycling in and out doing their 2-month tours. And you were expected to give them a little bit of a pep talk when they arrived and tell them, a little bit about why we're here and what we're doing. And I had a hard time with it, just starting to ask bigger questions about like, why? Like, what are we really going to do, throwing ourselves into this giant mess as a Western nation, unless you're planning to stay here forever and ever, which obviously didn't happen and ended very poorly. You're just creating a power vacuum. So at the end of the day, it's like, execute the mission safely and effectively, look after your, those that you're flying with, and get home safely. And in the individual villages, sure, for a portion of time, we were doing some good things, but I started asking some bigger questions about what we were doing. And anybody who's been in the military, I remember reading Sebastian Junger's got a book called War, some of which is about why men go to war. And if you ask those men, they're not going to give you a speech about God and country. They're there because of the guys they're there with, and you want to look after the people that you're fighting with. And so that becomes really the motivation. And people that leave after, when they look back, it's like, hey, do you miss it? Well, I miss the guys that I worked with. But yeah, I started to ask some bigger questions towards the latter.
But this is important. That's an interesting observation, because I think that points to the hierarchy of loyalties that we need in our life. That as much as I do believe in patriotism, I believe in the reality of nations to a degree. But we are meant to live with responsibilities to the people in front of our faces. And part of the dysfunction of the globalist agenda is a total inversion, that we have these responsibilities to people 1,000 miles away, and they're trying to corrupt our responsibilities to even our children. Like the NDP now are passing legislation I read last night that's making spanking illegal. There's already, the criminal code says you can't abuse your children. Like this is already, you're not allowed to do that in Canada. But they're going so far as, anyways, so there's like this undermining of the relationship that we have to our neighbors, to our family, to our space, to our children. And yet we're supposed to go fight in these forever wars, and the bonds of loyalty are different.
Well, and if you
collectivist world,
and especially if you look at what happened to a lot of those guys that came back afterward. I mean, you probably remember that famous little town hall where there's this veteran asking Trudeau, like, why are we just throwing veterans to the? And it's like, well, we can't afford this anymore. Meanwhile, they're spending money on all sorts of other things, right? And you understand where those loyalties actually sit. And so we'll probably talk about it a little bit later, but I think I've even seen that over the continuum of 2020 until now in terms of the focus, even my own focus on what we're doing and why we're doing it. A lot of it started to come closer to home, and what are you doing within that individual sphere of responsibility before you start trying to take on bigger things. So from a military perspective, sure, I miss the camaraderie, the flying of the airplane, flying military aircraft. I flew it tactically, so you're down at 200 feet.
Wow.
Because that's the safest place to be in a giant, not giant, but a big airplane that doesn't go very fast is as close to the ground as possible.
Not exactly the most maneuverable plane, though.
No. Surprisingly for something that size, but in terms of our tactical defense, that's how we employed it. So you're yanking and banking and throwing stuff out the back, and that doesn't go so well at the airlines, right? Like it's so they you could do it once. I always say you could try anything once, right? But that's the end of your career pretty much. So,
did you have a cooling off period when you got to the airlines? Like, hey,
you can't do this.
Things different around here.
Listen, sport. Just go up in a line, come down on a line, boom.
Yeah, that's it.
Follow the flight plan.
Right. Yeah, so that's so that part of it, the hands and feet part, as we call it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun going up over cottage country in the fall and seeing the colors and yanking and banking and doing all that stuff. But yeah, it's a very different gig as far as the airline goes. So that's what kind of brought me up to to that wonderful, whatever it was, February, March, April, somewhere in there of 2020 when life got very different.
Right.
So,
and so is that when did you exit the military?
well, I left in 2006.
Okay.
So I'd been at the airline for quite a few years.
Yes.
But you left the airline in 2020?
Left.
Well,
Wow.
so a little while after that, along with a bunch of other Canadians that suddenly found themselves doing things they hadn't foreseen career-wise.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So you grew up in a Christian home,
Yeah.
and went into the military, followed your father. I didn't know that about your father.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're flying for the airlines. And what led, maybe even just briefly, to the formation of Free to Fly?
The genesis of Free to Fly.
Yeah. So backstory, there's two ways I know you. So when you first sat in my office, I'm like, I know this guy. One, we met at a trailer park years before.
Trailer park.
We had a conversation at a trailer park. Our trailer was beside his, the one we were renting, and we chatted for a while, like 3-4 years, maybe
Probably
5
more
years
than
ago.
that.
Yeah. And the other one was we saw his picture in some publication online for Free to Fly, and which he'll explain. And my wife, I remember we were looking at it during the craziness, and she's like, I bet that guy's a Christian. And then turns out he is.
Yeah. And here we are.
And here we
That's
are.
it. That's the whole story right there.
Yeah, that's it. So what were you, like, the one pushing, like, leading the Free to Fly thing? Like, it was you and someone else, or just you?
Yeah,
Or?
well, it was myself and my good friend, Matt Sattler.
Okay.
But there's a bit of a... So, 2020, I'll step back a little bit. I was chairing a private school board at the time. And so out of that, it's like, hey, we're gonna shut the schools down and keep all these kids at home. And I was like, what? And I'm a bit of a data geek, like I like spreadsheets. So all I did really, in my initial epiphany, was taking government data. I wasn't in some corner watching BitChute videos. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I just started crunching government data, and literally 20 minutes later, I thought, what on earth is going on? Like, this doesn't make sense. And then from there, of course, started reading a whole bunch more, and was like, man, this is not good where we're going.
But that's the danger of doing your own research.
So what was it about the numbers that didn't make sense to you?
Well, I remember saying to others at the school, like, if we're going to keep them home, then statistically speaking, we should also keep them in the basement in rubber boots all summer long, because their danger of being struck by lightning is like 3 times higher statistically than it is of dying from COVID. Just, you can start coming up with speaking points like that that play well with a certain crowd and maybe not so well with the others. There just wasn't a real willingness to talk about some of that. So that's just a bit of a side story. But then as we move towards the, hey, this vaccine's going to save us, I remember thinking, like, that's all your eggs in one basket, which is generally never a good idea. And then I thought, wow, we travel all over the world, and if they're coming after anybody with this, like, if it's going to be something where you split up society, the airline world is probably going to be one of the first ones to be required. So I remember it clear as day. I'd just gone out to kind of do a bit of a workout. I was running around a sports field, and I was like doing, I don't know, chin-ups on a goal post or something. And I only mention that because I distinctly remember, and I think we've all had those moments throughout the COVID era where you remember like that as being the kind of the turning point.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, I need to get a group of guys together. And I'm like, you're scrambling a little bit. I thought, I'll try and get a hold of the JCCF, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom, because I was pretty naive at the time. Had a very limited understanding of law and the Constitution and otherwise. And I thought, well, the charter will save us, right? Like, and so
that's what it's there for.
Yeah. So there was 4 of us that were willing to put our names on a letter. And I understood that there was risks involved, because I remember having a talk with the guys and saying, like, you need to understand the implications. Like, this might not end well for us. So there was another really solid Christian friend of mine that I've known back from my early flight training days. He was in the military as well. And then interestingly, 2 other airline pilots that their families came out of Eastern Europe. So they understood what was at stake.
Wow.
So that was the start of it. We had a Zoom call. We did a bunch of talking. And then Matt Sattler and myself just kind of formed what was Free to Fly. And so it started with a handful of pilots. And then as the mandates came out, grew to several thousand aviation employees across the spectrum, whether that's flight attendants, maintenance folks. And then, very importantly for us, was to also capture all of the passengers that weren't able to fly. So it grew quite rapidly, close to 40,000. There was about 38,000 passengers, and then the aviation employees, and essentially providing support for each other throughout the season. Trying to do what we could from a legal perspective, coordinating efforts with the unions, which completely just checked out, and it was like, just do the right thing or lose your job, man. Like, that's your only choice. Unfortunately, there was such a small group. Like, if you look at the aviation industry in the States, there was a reasonable number, and I'm not talking 40%. We're talking maybe 10%. Of their pilots at some of the airlines down there just said, we're not doing it, man. Like, and the companies do a cost benefits analysis and realize that it's not going to work. Unfortunately, in Canada, it was a really, really like less than 1% at the end. And there was a bigger group initially, and I know the pilot demographic more than most. So at my company, probably a few hundred that were hard set against it. And a lot of people didn't think they would actually kick you out the door. But then if we got closer and closer to the deadline, which was the 31st of October of 21, guys are like, wow, like, I'm going to literally lose my job and my entire career, because there was nowhere else you could fly. People like, go fly in the bush. And it's like, no, it didn't matter. Yeah. Anything that was under that Transport Canada mandate, you had no choice. So yeah, I can't remember what your question was, but I've just been talking for a while.
Well, that's what led to Free to Fly.
Yes, yeah. So that was where it that was how it started.
Yeah. So you had mentioned, and we've kind of all been here, is that we've been through that crisis and we've been through that fight, and then we're kind of looking ahead. And I mean, this is maybe a good time to recap the conference before we springboard too. Is what we wanted to talk about at the conference is a positive vision for moving forward. And I mean, every day some new kind of crazy is coming down the pipeline. If all we do is read the news headlines every day and, moan about what's coming, like, that's not productive. It's actually destroying. It sucks the soul out of you, right? So we did a conference on a call to build, and maybe we could share a couple highlights from that. I was encouraged by the conference, and there's a couple takeaways I have, but maybe we'll start with you, Jared. What was some takeaways for you?
Takeaways? I mean, maybe points more encouragements. Like, all the talks I thought were very good. I'm always encouraged by Pastor Aaron Rock's practicality. And he just, he's one of those guys you just love having on your side. Yeah. Because he's so confident and so calm. And but just hearing him sort of pick up where Nate left off the night before, speaking about the need to, have dominion and how that works out. I think Aaron Rock filled in a lot of the gaps in what does that look like, and some of the other theological things that had to kind of get tied together. And then just the practicalities of it. And then, of course, Pastor Jacob Riom's sermon on the Friday night was just a huge challenge, really. I mean, laying it out there that nothing we do will matter if we're not doing it in prayer and, of course, in the will of the Lord. So, right. So unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain. And trying to keep us oriented on that. The Q&A was fun. I thought you guys did a good job with that, so that was good. Yeah, I don't know. Those were some of the high points. And the coffee was fantastic.
There you go, Resistance Coffee.
Dark roast.
Yep. Fossil fuel soon to be illegal contraband. Apparently, if the NDP get their way. What a bunch of psychos, eh? It's like, it just dawned on me afresh that our country is not necessarily overall filled with communists, but the ruling class is like 95% communist.
Yeah. And people are just willing to go along with it.
Yeah, they just go along with it.
Which is the only way communists ever win.
Yeah. So Greg, what about you? You attended the conference. Were you there for the whole time?
Yep. The whole thing.
What were some points of encouragement for you, if there were any, assuming there were some?
Yeah. No, it was great. I said as I advance in years, I need to take notes. So I would have carefully consulted my notebook if I'd known this question was coming, so I'd sound more lucid. But no, I've brought up Jacob's sermon a couple times over the past just over the past week in some conversations I'm having along similar lines, and just seeing that reflected in my own life. And thinking back to it reminded me of Steve Richardson's Friday night at the Church at War conference as well, talking about our prayerlessness and how ingratitude and prayerlessness can lead to long seasons of just wandering, right? Because we are, as you alluded, in a season where we're trying to figure out what comes next and what should we be doing, and we'd like super clear answers. And I think I'll say, well, I'm praying about it, but really, how much time am I really earnestly praying about it? And I appreciated your message. It was a Hebrews 11, as I recall, which in where we're at right now is a phenomenal one to return to regularly, of that idea of that multi-generational requirement of not thinking, because I see it in the circles that I spin in. People want immediate solutions, and it's what results in this obsession with politics and legal solutions, and it's like, no, man, you've got to think about your grandkids and working with that kind of a timeline, and the small daily acts of obedience are what bring about change, and they're not exciting, and we don't see quantifiable results a lot of time. And as a type A guy, I get it. I find it frustrating. I want to see things happening right now, but being reminded that no, like they worked and labored without seeing the immediate fruits of what they were working towards. So those were some moments that stand out.
I appreciated everything you guys said, and one thing I thought was great was there was a lot of informal conversation. Like I've been to the big conferences. I've been to T4G, TGC, I've been to Chicago, Louisville, and they're great in that they're very obviously gifted people who are leading the sessions. But my experience is the road trip is the best part, right? Going down with a couple of guys, getting closer fellowship with some brothers that you don't otherwise get, hanging out in the hotel, good food for thought from the sessions. But I often think, you know what, we could have done this with some pizza back home and saved $1,000. And in a smaller conference, you can talk to people a lot more. So when you're in an arena, you talk to your friends, really. You don't really connect with other people. But we had people from Alberta, from Saskatchewan, and it was awesome to see so many people making connections with other like-minded believers. And that's one of the strategies, talking strategy moving forward is we have to stick together. We have to find people who are putting their hand to the plow, who are getting on the Mayflower, and we have to, use each other's strengths and make up for each other's weaknesses and pray for one another. And whatever comes down the pipe, I mean, God has ordained that these things are accomplished as a body, not as just a hero. And even the most gifted among us is nothing without the hand, without the foot, whatever, right? So that was an encouragement.
I thought it was well timed. Like the timing of all the sessions was good. There was a lot of time in between for that fellowship. It wasn't just right from one thing to another. Which often you burn out after 3 or 4 sessions. Halfway through the day, you're like, I can't take any more in. But there was sort of good pauses. Another one was Pastor Josh Mills. Did you guys sit in on that breakout?
I caught the end of it.
That was just hearing him talk about evangelism just makes you want to, just run out into the street and start reading the Psalms or something like that. I don't know. But again, convicting. Yes. Like this is something we really need to get on.
Well, that's one thing I've been thinking about is that there's it feels as though Christians are not in the public conversation the way the prophets were. And I've kind of mentioned this to you off air, but I personally, and maybe it's like, Jeremiah, if I don't speak, maybe I feel that as a preacher, but I feel it's guilt might be too strong, but almost an angst or like I'm not doing something I ought to be doing when I'm not speaking publicly. And it's not about self-promotion or a platform or something like that. It just feels like Christians need to be involved in the public conversation, and we just actually aren't. And so I've been reflecting on this. One of the things I'm thinking through, maybe to throw out to you guys, is it seems like at least some of the prophets, and certainly John the Baptist and Jesus' ministry, and even Paul, if you look at where he went, they not only spoke the truth, but they actually did things to draw a crowd to hear the truth. Mm-hmm. So there's obviously extreme examples of some of the prophets doing, walking around naked and
or lay on your side for 3 months or whatever.
Yeah.
Bore a hole in this wall. There was often like some type of theatrical element to it. Yeah.
Yes. And they were a spectacle.
Yeah.
And it wasn't to draw attention to them. It was to draw attention to them so that they could draw attention to God. Because when a culture is so steeped in idolatry, your biggest obstacle is indifference. Mm-hmm. It's like no one cares. Mm-hmm. No one wants to listen. It's not as though they hear you and reject you. It's like no one even hears you. And I remember, I don't know if you were there, but when I spoke at the first protest here, and it was the first time I'd ever done anything like this publicly, and I felt nervous about it. I'm telling you, there were 1,000 people there, and everyone was chattering through all the other speeches. And when I got up, I said nothing that was unique to me. It was almost verbatim scripture, about the gospel. Christ came not for the healthy, but the sick, and this type of thing. Like you could have heard a pin drop in the park, and everyone just stopped and listened. It was like this in Ottawa too, that everyone had ears to hear. Is clearly God was doing this. Like if I stood down the cenotaph in a normal time, no one would even look at me. Like if I put a speaker out there and talk, no one would even look at me. So I'm kind of being long-winded, but I'm just wondering what you think about part of the church's strategy is do things to actually get people to listen to you. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, is this something you've thought about, or does this resonate with you, or does it sound crazy or what?
No, I feel guilt about this too, because I feel like we should be like, you don't wait for sinners to come to you.
No.
You're supposed to go to where they are.
Yeah.
Right. And share the gospel with them. So, I mean, apart from our regular duties that we have, this should be part of our ministry, whether it's, we have our ministry with our families, with our church, and whatever responsibilities we have there. But this is also a responsibility, our love for neighbor, right? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I'm with you. And it's just...
Like Paul would go to the synagogues, right? He'd say, where are people going to listen? Where are we going to get an audience? There's none of this. Just go stand somewhere and pray that something happens. Like, yeah, you do pray that something happens, but there's John the Baptist is dressed funny and eating locusts. Like he was a spectacle of a man. Mm-hmm. And even Jesus' ministry, Jesus was obscure. Remember what they said of him? Is this a carpenter's son? It's like, what?
I know that guy.
Yeah, it's like, what happened to that dude? All of a sudden, it's not as though it was the first time he told the truth. He was the sinless Son of God. He's only ever told the truth. But it was like when he was, 12 in the temple and he's teaching them, you know what I mean? And then when he comes out of the wilderness in the power of the Spirit, his life changes to a public ministry.
Yeah.
And I just think the Christianized world is used to having the gospel relegated to buildings. And we have our own carved out places where we're allowed to worship. But then pluralism kind of pushes us to those corners, and now we're like, no one cares. And then there's, we send missionaries to do that type of thing. But the part of the, the Great Awakening was open air preaching. Whitfield over here, but even the Wesley brothers, and the big thing was leaving the four walls of the church. It wasn't so much about like the open air was to get out to where the people were.
Yeah.
To go to the camps where people working, where the lower class were, the people who weren't coming to you.
Yeah, I mean, this was a thing with Bunyan too, right? Like he wanted to go preach in other places that weren't authorized.
Yes, right? Exactly.
It's like, oh, no, I want to go to this hall down here where all these people hang out and go preach there.
Yeah.
Well, and that's been, for me, I mean, I've been very convicted, like you said, with Josh's breakout for sure. And even in my own sphere, right, with Free to Fly as an example, I don't know how long ago it was. It was probably around the Church at Wartime. I was very convicted, and not that we'd ever hidden our faith in terms of what we were doing, but that, like you said, that this wasn't created explicitly as an organization that was geared towards faith, but that this is a platform and that you need to use it to glorify me. So that's what we've been trying to do over the last couple of years more explicitly. And like you said, almost without fail, there are people that'll say, I don't know, we don't want to hear that from you, Jesus freak or whatever. But for the most part, people will say, I've gone back to reading my Bible, or I've returned to my faith because it is a desperate situation and there aren't clear answers for people. And I've said there literally is no hope aside from Christ. And so what am I supposed to say publicly in those forums that I'm able to speak to it? And I feel pretty ill-equipped. It's been a real awakening for me over the last number of years. I grew up in a Christian home, but in my mid-50s, and I think, what do I have to show for it? And in this latter season of my life, I guess, if you want, it's almost this panic feeling of, man, you wasted way too much time. I know I sound like the old guy, and maybe it's normal when you're in your 50s, but I'm the guy that's talking to 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds now, saying, don't waste those years, because you get to this part, and when you do have a platform to speak, you feel like I just feel inadequate in it some, but God is good in equipping and bringing fruit from it. But I think every opportunity that we have, it's just a blessing to be able to speak to it when provided and when we have those opportunities.
Well, we all feel a little slow of speech, as it were.
Yeah.
Even the best in Scripture, felt that way. So I think that's in some ways good. We don't feel too haughty about our own abilities, right?
Yeah, and the Lord, I mean, he tells Moses, right? Moses complains and says, like, I've never been a good speaker. It's like, well, who is it that causes man to speak?
Yeah.
Like, I'm the one who causes man to speak. So, but again, Moses went, and that brings me back to my kind of what I'm ruminating on is like, is there, as far as strategy, is there a way of engaging or creating a spectacle that we're over? Even to say that, it sounds like it's not a Christian thing to say, like to cause a spectacle, to get people to listen. But I actually think it is biblical within certain boundaries, right? And I don't think we can sit back and kind of wait and just chalk it up to God's providence or sovereignty and not raising us up if we're not pursuing those opportunities. Like, if the door closes, you can't get in. That's one thing. But have you tried? Like where are we engaging publicly and not waiting to be invited? Like Jesus and Paul and John, no one invited them.
You didn't get an invitation to the Areopagus.
You know what I mean? Yeah. It's like, I'm going to go where the people are talking and where the people are, and I'm going to go share the gospel with them. I'm going to go. And it wasn't always those sermons. Like, he did go house to house, and Jesus ate with people, and there's a place to develop relationships and kind of organic evangelism too. But the point is, like, he went out, the fishers of men, right? You have to go cast your nets. And I just feel as though, like, what we do on a Sunday in corporate worship is a little bit of that. We're aware. And I always think when I'm preaching of people who aren't believers, I try to anticipate objections and this type of thing. But that's not really the going out there, So maybe it'll come to me, but that's what I've been thinking about. Is that there's a severe lack in that, and we can't just wait for people to come to us to preach the gospel. So moving forward, we've talked a little bit offline, Greg, and you've kind of alluded to it that even in your military service, you realize, like, people's loyalties are to the guy beside them. And maybe our priorities need to be more aligned with that as well. Focusing on your family, focusing on the local church, focusing on your actual neighbors. Whether or not we get a good opinions in the court, whether or not we have a turnaround at the political level is in many ways out of our hands, but our immediate duties are things that we can give ourselves to. Is this a shift that's taken place in your thinking? You kind of alluded to that.
Yeah. In part because I think we were all a little bit naive about how crazy things would actually get in a very short period of time.
Right.
And realistically, as far as free to fly goes, our raison d'etre, the core one, was that travel mandate.
Yes.
And so once that was suspended, the majority of people went back to work. There's still some that didn't. WestJet was one company that was particularly vicious with some of their people, not quite the friendly
people they pretend to be.
Yeah. But aside from that, a lot of people just kind of moved on. But at the same time, you've got this incessant and increasing craziness, for lack of a better term. And so as part of what we do, we've got these chat groups that everybody's in, and a lot of it just devolves into endless sharing of news posts, like over and over and over and over again, right?
Yeah.
And it becomes not so much demoralizing as it is frustrating, because it's really not producing any particular fruit, and you do start asking those questions. Well, what should we be doing? Where should we be going? And we have a class action lawsuit that's part of what we're working towards. Best case is going to drag through the courts for years, and it's not who we are or the biggest thing that we're working on, but it doesn't mean that we don't pursue that and force them to jump through some hoops and have some accountability. But separate from that, just starting to have conversations with people about what you should be doing, and asking myself that, and going back to what you're talking about. And I had, a mini epiphany myself a couple of years ago, where I was, doing all this quote unquote freedom fighting, just obscene amounts of time. And a lot of it's just sitting at a laptop, hammering away at stuff endlessly. And then realizing my wife, who never complains about anything, is suffering in the process because I'm not present in our home. And not to the point where you've completely checked out, because I've said this publicly a few times, and she's like, "Oh, don't be so hard on yourself." But I think that conviction, comes from God, that you are not being the husband you need to be, you're not being the father you need to be. And having one of my kids say the same thing, right? I'm like, "Well, why didn't you tell me this?" And he's like, "Dad, because you're way too busy with other stuff." And so that was part of that process of thinking, if we don't have solid homes that form solid churches that then maybe start actually impacting the local community, then we're in the wrong business. And I see it just looking out at other things that are happening within what we call the freedom movement that are pretty unpalatable and really not productive. There's almost this look at me culture that's gotten out there, right? And you think this is going nowhere. Like, this has just become another version of Hollywood almost, right? Like it's the freedom Hollywood, that it's like, how many followers do you have and how many clicks are you getting? And I've confronted people and said, you're just another version of scaremongering, right? It's just our own version of the New York Times and CNN. Like, this isn't healthy within some of the stuff that's happening aviation wise. So then trying to get people to look back at where are you, first of all, in your relationship with God, and doing what we can with our organization to speak to that overtly, consistently, every opportunity we have. And again, and I'll still see myself reverting back to that, type A driven guy that's like, why isn't this happening faster? And then realizing, no, like, this is about relationships, and relationships. It's like with your kids, it's like, why aren't they getting this? And how much time are you actually spending with them? Relationship building, like that takes time. And so I think it's gone from, you've got these extremes of people saying, well, write a letter to Justin Trudeau, which is probably the most useless thing you can do. Yeah. But trying to get right to the top and make things happen immediately, to moving almost to the other end of the spectrum with no, where are you personally, number one, and where's your family next, and that being the starting point. So that for me has been a shift, and it doesn't play that well really in the bigger. Like if you want to get a lot of followers in the social media game, that doesn't tend to translate into metrics. But we have to say, who cares? That's not the game that we're playing. Like, we want to be solid, men leading our families in healthy ways that we're called to biblically.
Amen. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's not much to add to that. I think, and it's like I was going through Hebrews. You have to be content with leaving the results to the Lord. You have to be content, like a farmer sows his seed, and but you know, one man sows, another man reaps. But it's like God who gives the growth, and we're just not very comfortable. We're results driven, and we're immediate, quick, and results. And a lot of the most important work of God is the antithesis to that. It's slow, consistent plodding without seeing the fruit of your labor, but trusting in the God who gives growth. And that takes discipline, that takes faith. And not that there aren't other, you know, as opportunities arise to partner and initiatives and whatever, but the reality is, you know, it's going to be the sowing, that kind of sowing. And as I tell you guys, we're at the rock picking phase of this project. We're not on the storm the cathedral and have a, you know, a preaching fest phase. We're like, let's clear some land here. And a lot of people don't want to do that.
Yeah, that imagery has been so helpful for me. You and I had a conversation a couple months ago about that, and I've just shamelessly stolen it and used it a number of times because it does. I think the power of that imagery and using it as story is so important, because you have to be willing to just grind through that season for the rest of your days on earth, right? And I think people have to understand that we're in this battle that's what we're called to, right? We're in this battle for the rest of our days. And if we toil away in obscurity, which is something we heard about at the conference as well, and I think that's so key as well, and I'm constantly convicted by that. It's like, are you willing to just do this in total obscurity? Because I have had an opportunity to speak publicly, but I'm also aware of hundreds, thousands of stories of people that have acted way more faithfully than I have, that are just doing that in humility in the dark, day after day after day. And that's what we're called to. And we have to, if God lays before us, this is the task that I want you to work on for the next 30 years. We have to be willing to say, cool, like that's what I'm called to, and that's what I need to be willing to hear and to walk in.
Yeah, Jeremy mentioned how Scripture interprets history, and one of the, if you've grown up with Scripture, you have a certain historical narrative that you're comfortable, that you're familiar with. This isn't the narrative that most people in the world would think about. The world would be shaped around Egypt, Babylon, like
Genghis Khan.
Not Israel. You know what I mean? And that's kind of a central feature, that but God's work in the world is centered around the people that he says, you were the least of the people, right? Like, I didn't choose you because you were this great nation. I called a bunch of pagans, you know, and I made a covenant with them, and I redeemed their ancestors from slavery, and I made a covenant with them. And, you know, I intend that through, you know, my people, I'm going to manifest my glory as they walk in obedience and faith. Well, the whole story, and then you get to the church. When Jesus left, it wasn't there weren't thousands of people. Like, all of his disciples even left, and what was left was in an upper room, terrified. And the Holy Spirit came, and boom, revival. But even that, even so much of the Scripture, if we were to be reporters at the time, we wouldn't report the story the same. We wouldn't look out and say, what's the event of the day? What's the main thing? What's moving the world right now? What are the big events coming down the pipeline? It's not going to be, you know, Esther. You know, it's not going to be Ruth. It's not going to be, you know, so many of the people in Scripture that we look back and see that literally the world changed through them. But not because they had the power, not because it changed quickly, you know, but because they were faithful to God. And I just think, you know, that is the perspective that we need moving forward. Give yourself to the mundane things. Give yourself to the things that no one praises you for, no one follows you for, no one says thank you for, and pray that God gives growth. So,
amen to that.
Yeah.
Practical stuff. So we talked a lot at the conference, and actually there wasn't a lot of practical stuff at the conference. And I think strategy is now kind of what we want to talk about, right? Like a lot of it was the theological basis, you know, having to rely on God, the need to even be taking dominion in the first place.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, most of us are just like, okay, good. What do I do?
Yeah. Well, I think in light of what we just talked about, a lot of it is not what you're thinking. It's like, go do the things you knew you were supposed to do before, to love your wife and love your husband and raise your children and be a faithful member of a church and, you know, work at your job as unto the Lord. You know, that's like 99% of what you need to do. And if along the course of that path, God raises you up for a particular duty, right? Or opportunity, then take it. But I think what Greg was alluding to and what I feel as well is the path to victory looks a lot different than I thought it did maybe 3 years ago. You know, the path to victory is not the battle that I thought it was. But I will say, I still just do feel we're not in the public conversation, and I don't know the practical solution to that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's like an online thing to be more in the conversation, to be putting our resources towards getting the truth out there. Like the internet is the Roman roads, you know, let's use that. I don't know if that's a physical face-to-face thing. I just feel this angst about we're not in the conversation. There's people who need to hear the truth who are not hearing the truth. And I don't know the first step to that.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. It seems like the evangelistic piece is the key here.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to convince us too hard that, you know, our immediate responsibilities are really important.
Yeah.
And that it's 90%. Like, yeah, family, kids, job. I think we're all like, yeah, it's good. But
yeah.
That evangelistic thing, I mean, the gospel going out, like we don't claim to be able to change the world apart from the gospel anyway.
Yeah.
So why aren't we using this more? Why aren't we?
Well, and I think partly this is a concern about seeing the where revolution can go.
Yeah.
And that's not good.
No.
So what they're planning to do, like, can you imagine they pass this legislation that literally makes traditional parenting illegal? Like, you can't spank your kid. Like, it makes a requirement of scripture illegal. And they push these things through and they start killing people with mental illness on top of abortion. All this. There is a threshold where it won't be tolerated.
That's right.
And at that point, you can either seek reform according to the law or revolution apart from it. And revolution apart from the law is not good for anyone.
Yeah.
Not just because in the immediate, a lot of people get hurt, but the consequences can be worse. You can end up in a worse situation because now the clamp down by tyrants is justified.
Look at Russia. Look at what happened to France after the revolution. I mean, it's never good.
No, it's not good. So, but one of the ways we avoid a sinful revolution is we proactively lead as Christians, as truth tellers. What are the steps we need to be taking? And I find in the freedom world right now is all unbelievers. It's all unbelievers raging against the man. And, you know, there was a time when everyone was listening to James Coates' sermons on Romans 13 and Tim Stevens' sermons because they were going to jail. And tons of people we know who aren't Christians were listening to them. They gained a huge audience. And they're going on Tucker Carlson. His wife is going on Tucker. The Lord gave them an opportunity. And the Gospels tell this. Jesus said that he talks about his disciples would go before magistrates to testify to the truth. Like, so maybe part of this
on their way to being martyred.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But part of me wonders if maybe that's part of the spectacle is someone needs to burn a pride flag and film it or something. Like there needs to be something to get these people's attention. But Christians need to be leading the conversation because when we back into the conversation, we bow into the conversation, the alternative is bad.
Yeah, well, and I some of what you're saying, I was just reading something today, but it's that idea of, you know, dominion taking, but in the context of covenant,
right.
That it's not strictly about just, like you said, raging against the machine constantly with no particular it's in the military, we used to call it all thrust, no vector, right? Like there's all this thrust, but it's not going anywhere in particular. And I totally hear what you're saying. And I've had the same kind of angst, and I just sitting and talking about all these things. And I remember saying to my wife, like, I just feel like, hey, Mr. Keyboard Warrior, like, what are you actually doing yourself other than telling everybody else what all these good things are? And so, just as one example, because I'd seen somebody else do it, I told you about the same thing. We just had a potluck in our local community.
So good.
Send out an email to like 30 people, and 110 people showed up.
That's amazing.
But what it says is there is this visceral desire for connection, and I think that can segue into some of what you're talking about, because a good chunk of them were Christian, but there was some there that weren't, and there were some great conversations that came out of it because they have this desperate need inside of them, and that's the hope, that we can speak to. So that's just one small example of and my neighbor as an example. Like how can I connect with him? How can I talk? Rough around the edges farmer from my local community, and he. All shaved up, had on his best suspenders, and he was out there and got to meet some good people, right? And it didn't change his life overnight, but now we've got a context because he doesn't even have a computer, I don't think. So I printed out, it was a very clear invitation that this is why we're gathered, because this is our hope in Christ. Yeah. And he and his wife decided to come out. That's so these awesome. Are tiny little things that can be done. And what's easier than something like a potluck, right? Like a bunch of people bring food and you all get to eat. And and again, it didn't change the community overnight, but you've now established connections for some of those things you're alluding to, where let's say it does get actually really crazy. Well, now I know that John, this businessman, has ABC, and I can connect with, and you're kind of starting to connect people in practical ways, like expend your money at businesses that see the world the same as you, rather than giving your money to some other gas station that's not owned by somebody that has the same worldview as you, right? And that's just a forum to connect people that are outside our current circles, because what you're saying is, how do we get outside just what's happening with my church crowd or whatever? How do I interact with the culture? So yeah, it's stuff that I'm certainly wrestling with still as well, but.
There certainly is in the freedom movement. I mean, most of these people aren't believers, so they're enslaved to sin too. Just because maybe they see a different form of evil that they want to fight against doesn't mean that they're righteous. And so what I see from a lot of people is this. It's the same thing you see with people on the left. It's blaming, right? And people are blaming others for their own faults. And it's like, sure, you're blaming a government that's tyrannical, but you still have to take responsibility. And so, I mean, that's great, because we need to take the open door of people who maybe see rightly some issues, but are wrongly attributing the
soul. It's like the sole responsibility is someone else.
No, you're still a slave to sin. That's why you're feeling the way you are. It's like, yeah, I mean, tyrants are going to tyrant, and they don't make it comfortable for any of us. But you still have to, you still have to deal with God. You're not going to get a pass because Justin Trudeau called you a racist.
Well, and that whole piece about freedom too. Like I remember thinking that about a year and a half ago too. Right? It was all this like freedom, and then it's like, it's not just about endless freedom, right? Like I remember Solzhenitsyn gave a speech at Harvard back in 1978, well worth looking up if you ever get a chance. But he spoke to a lot of that, which is phenomenal given what you know about his history, and talking about for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, democracy and freedom were really attached to our responsibility before God. And there's really no amount of advancement in the Western era, including our ventures into space, can make up for the moral decay that we've seen in the West, because there is this decoupling from your responsibility before God. It's just freedom, 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 and my rights are my rights, and yet there's no responsibility before God, and that's why we're at where we're at. And I think you're starting to see people talk about this. I know lawyer Bruce Pardy brought this up, and actually he and David Haskell are having a debate on this in April, I think, over this whole issue. which it's whatever you could say, it's creating some fractions, but I think it's a conversation that probably needs to happen as well. So.
Yeah, that's just licentiousness. Like freedom forever is just licentiousness, and people want that. They want to be able to do whatever they want, but it's like, no, that's not what liberty is.
Well, it's also it's irrational in the sense it's not possible.
Yeah,
it's an illusion because our lives are too connected, so that you doing whatever you want at some point will run up against someone else's what they want. It's completely theoretical, and it's not real. So it's like, on top of whether it's, right or wrong has to correspond to reality, right? But I'm interested to hear that debate, because when I read Party's article, who I really appreciate the work that he's done, he's a co-belligerent for sure.
Yeah.
I thought, wow, this is the dead end of libertarianism. Like, it's just a whole lot of internal contradictions, and I didn't like how they framed the debate, virtue versus liberty.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's kind of assuming the whole point that we want to question. Like, what in the world is freedom apart from virtue? But hopefully, is it David Haskell is his name?
Yeah.
Okay, hopefully he's up for the task.
Yeah. I think so.
He's a Canadian guy, right?
Yeah. Solid Christian guy.
Do you know him?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
And sorry, who's he debating?
Bruce Party.
Bruce Party's a lawyer. Well, he teaches at...
He taught at Queen's, and then he lost that for the same reason others of us lost our job. But he's been very helpful behind the scenes with us as well, just helping frame my own education on how futile a lot of our legal efforts are in Canada, and the history of the Charter, and the lack of grant assistance that it is to us now, and why that is, right? So.
Yeah. Well, good. I think that's lots to chew on.
Yeah, I think we've bloviated enough for one day, huh?
Are you a little encouraged yet, Jerry?
Yeah.
You getting there?
Sure.
Good.
Yeah. It's always an encouragement.
Moving the dial a little bit.
Yeah.
That's great.
Maybe I just need like a steak or something like that. I don't know.
Hey, we're having some pizza if you want to come over for dinner, dude.
Last time I had pizza, I ended up at the hospital,
Did you?
Well, they get the gallstones and all that sort of thing. And then they wouldn't let me in because I wouldn't put a mask on. But
sorry, man.
I'm in pain. Well, if you put a mask on, we can help you.
Yeah.
Right, I'm going home. I'll just wait it out.
Well, I tried to cheer you up.
Well, that makes me chuckle. So you just cheered me up. It worked. I'm happy again.
Good.
All right. Well, I'll leave you with our normal call out. May he have dominion from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. May all kings fall down before him. All nations serve him. See you next time.